Oh no, I think my anxiety is coming back. Okay, stay calm, stay calm. Remember, you were taught those anxiety beating tics that got rid of anxiety for you a couple of years ago when you were suffering. Just do those again. That'll definitely get rid of anxiety. Crikey, why isn't this stuff working? 2 years ago, this stuff seemed to work really well. Help! Over the last 20 years helping people to beat anxiety, I've heard of this kind of thing happening on many occasions. Times where people's reliable anxiety beating strategies seemingly stop working. So why on earth does that happen? And how do you make sure that this doesn't happen to you? As an ex-anxiety sufferer myself who now specialises in helping others to become free from anxiety, I used to get stumped when anxiety beating strategies that used to work well for people suddenly stop working. These days I'm really less fazed by it, as if this is you, there is almost always a particular pattern that you're falling for. By the way, this pattern can also explain why some people who really suffer with terrible anxiety struggle to find anything that really works for them reliably. So listen up, because this information contained here could just transform your thinking and therefore your life. By the way, I'm passionate about helping spread practical strategies for beating anxiety as well as psychological hacks for improving your life. So I'm constantly creating new content on YouTube that when people subscribe now and then click the bell, they get notified when the new content comes out. So to help you really get this, let me share with you the anxiety equation. By the way, this is not mine. I came across this when exploring the mindfulness expert Shinzen Young, where he talked about suffering is the result of pain multiplied by resistance. However, I write this up a touch differently. I like to think of it as experience multiplied by resistance equals suffering. So let's do an exercise together in order to help you understand this in a little more detail. But by the way, whilst most of the exercises I get people to do, you really can't mess up in that your experience is your own, it's totally valid whatever happens. This one is the only exception to that. You have been warned. I'm going to invite you to do a 1-minute meditation where you close your eyes and then you can allow any images, words or sensations to emerge. It doesn't matter what comes up for you. You literally can't screw this up unless you think of green polar bears. If any thoughts of green polar bears appear when you do this exercise, the whole thing will go horribly wrong. Go. Okay, hold on. Of course I'm teasing here, because if I set up this exercise from the perspective of you mustn't think green polar bears, then likely these green polar bear thoughts would likely start popping up all over the place. In other words, your experience is made up of the images in your head, the words you're saying to yourself, and the sensations in your body. And if I tell you that you mustn't have some of these, or you have to resist these, then likely you'll start going into suffering. So if I tell you that you mustn't have or you must resist the image of green polar bear, then when it appears, you likely start trying to get rid of it or battling with it. If I tell you that you have to resist the words green polar bear, then again, that would lead to suffering. Or if you tried not to imagine the sensation of green polar bear or think about what it would feel like if there really was a green polar bear in the room, then you'll likely end up with sensations of suffering. Why? Because the act of resisting is actually a way of telling yourself that it's dangerous and you have to get rid of it. Metaphorically speaking, I've had many people who tell me that they've been having green polar bear thoughts for the last 30 years, and I have to help them get rid of them. And what they're hoping for is to find someone who shows them how to resist all green polar bear thoughts more effectively. But can you see how that really wouldn't be the solution to the issue? Surely the best way to handle this would be to ask someone, is the mental image in your head of green polar bear actually a threat? Is the thought green polar bear actually a real green polar bear? In which case, do you need to get rid of it in order to stay safe? What about the word green polar bear? Is that a threat? Seriously, are the letters of the alphabet that make up the word green polar bear actually a threat to you? And therefore, do you have to get rid of them in order to stay safe? And then get curious about the sensations. Even if it feels like there is a green polar bear here, is the sensation actually a threat? Is there actually a green polar bear here? Instead of getting someone to resist green polar bear, what would happen if they suddenly saw that the thought green polar bear isn't actually a threat? They wouldn't have to resist it anymore, and therefore there would be no suffering. And by the way, here's the cool part. As I spoke about on my last YouTube video, my scariest anxiety symptom, The brain is like a radar scouting for danger, and stuff it doesn't think is dangerous, it tends to filter out and stop bringing up to alert you. The moment you truly see that the thoughts about green polar bears are totally safe and really don't pose a threat, they stop popping up as much. So how do you communicate in a physical and embodied way that they pose no threat? Well, by stopping resistance and asking yourself if the images, words or sensations really are a threat. But here's the whole paradox that this whole YouTube has been preparing to flag up for you. If someone's goal was to get rid of green polar bear thinking, and they hear someone say the best way to get rid of green polar bear thinking is to stop resisting it, then they ironically start telling themselves, I can have green polar bear thoughts in order that they stop coming up. But your body knows that you're doing this technique in the service of resistance. In other words, you're trying to pretend to yourself you're okay in order to resist green polar bears. It's just resistance again, in another form. However, you can ask yourself the questions, are these green polar bear thoughts a threat or real? From a place of curiosity, from a place of exploration, rather than in order to resist. And by the way, that is the reason I believe why sometimes people discover that suddenly anxiety beating tools that used to work suddenly seem to stop working. Think about it. They initially go through a bout of anxiety, perhaps go and see a therapist or read some techniques or approaches that work, and often they don't have high hopes or high expectations that these techniques or tools will work. So they just apply them to see what will happen. Apply them from a place of curiosity. However, now when they work, they log these tools mentally as, now I have a bunch of tools that work that get rid of anxiety. So a couple of years later, perhaps they're struggling with things as they go through a patch of life that's overwhelming and anxiety re-emerges. They now think to themselves, no worries, I'll just use the techniques that I know get rid of anxiety. In other words, they start doing the techniques in the service of resistance. They're really just dressing up the techniques in different clothes, the clothes of resistance. So if you really want to ensure that any anxiety beating tool is more likely to work for you, stop doing it from the perspective of getting rid of anxiety and start applying the tools from a place of curiosity, just to see and explore what will happen when you do, rather than from a place of having to get rid of it. Now, quick side note, many of you, I can hear it already, may have been shouting at the screen saying, but Howard, green polar bears aren't real. There are no such things as green polar bears, so your analogy just doesn't work. However, let me reassure you, the analogy works. Let's imagine it was the thought, what if something bad happens to me? You know, catastrophic thinking, and then people start labeling them as intrusive thoughts. What I'm suggesting is that the thought, what if something bad happens to me, is A, not the same as something bad happening to you, it's just a thought, and B, the thought, what if something bad happens to me, is not the same as something bad actually happening to you. It's the thoughts about these things that you're responding to, not the things themselves. But hey, a deeper insight on this is likely a topic for a future YouTube. Hope you've enjoyed. Feel free to leave your comments and questions below, and remember that by taking time to subscribe and to give this video a like, it helps to flag this video up as something that YouTube should push out further and can therefore help more people. Hope you enjoyed.